still viewed by police as the leader of the state's largest and most dangerous street gang. Joni Lum is here with the latest on today's raid. Joni?
Sonia and Dave, authorities believe Larry Hoover is running an enormous gang operation from inside the Dixon Correctional Center where he is housed. Chicago, Illinois, and IRS agents carried out a federal warrant at the offices of Save the Children Promotions, looking for evidence of income tax evasion and money laundering. The 44-year-old acknowledged leader of the Black Gangster Disciples has been in prison since 1973 for a drug-related murder. At several parole hearings, he's claimed he's a changed man who is no longer violent. Today, police spent about 2 hours combing through the records of Save the Children on the South Side. They seized half a dozen cardboard boxes and file cabinets of financial records and also $7,000 in cash. Police say the charity organization has legitimate operations, but they also believe it is a front for an effort to get Hoover out of jail. Police believe that Hoover has been running drug trafficking in the city of Chicago from his jail cell, and that potential tax law violations may be a way to dismantle the gang. Police also went to the home of...
For a quarter of a century, Larry Hoover has been incarcerated in the country's most draconian Supermax Prison, ADX Florence, located in Florence, Colorado. He spends 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, no larger than a parking space. For over 2 decades, he has virtually no contact with the outside world. He is, quite literally, buried alive. Absent an opportunity for resentencing, Mr. Hoover will die at ADX Florence without ever having embraced his grandchildren. Will the federal court grant Hoover a second chance to reclaim his life at the age of 71 years old? Not only is he doing life, he is doing life under cruel and unusual conditions at the ADX Supermax Prison, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. A place that former Warden Robert Hood said, ADX was not designed for humanity. When it's 23 hours a day in a room with a slit of a window where you can't even see the Rocky Mountains, let's be candid here. It's not designed for rehabilitation. Period. End of story. Hoover was raised on the south side of Chicago and reported having pleasant memories of his childhood and adolescence. Despite his relatively stable upbringing, Hoover joined the Black Pea Stone Nation during his adolescence in the 1960s. Violence was part of every day in Chicago back then and remains the same today. You see, Hoover was expelled from Francis Parker High School after being involved in a shooting in the front of the principal's office when he was a young man. By the late 1960s or early 1970s, Hoover had become a leader of the Supreme Gangsters. By 1973, King Hoover, as the defendant was known, had become the leader of an organization known as the Family that sold narcotics in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. Drugs were the name of the game, and that is where the profit was at. Dreams of coming up, living a life of riches, was on every young man's mind back then. Hoover wanted it all and was determined to get it at all costs, according to the government. In court papers filed on October 22, 2022, the government says at a meeting of his gang, Hoover ordered the execution of William Young and other workers suspected of stealing from Hoover's narcotic stash houses. On the night of February 26, 1973, Andrew Howard, a gang member under Hoover's command, shot Young in the head 6 times and dumped his body in an alley. Approximately 90 minutes after the murder, Hoover called another meeting and reported that he had gotten one of the guys that they was after, and he wanted the other 2 killed also before the week was out. Another one of Hoover's targets, Joshua Shaw, was murdered several months later in September 1973. After a jury trial in December 1973, Hoover and Howard were convicted of Young's murder, and the state judge would hand down a sentence of 150 to 200 years imprisonment. His young life at the age of 23 had been stamped out, forever changed. How did Larry Hoover rise to power? Hoover's rise to power is summarized in United States v. Aaron, where the 7th Circuit affirmed the conviction of Sonia Aaron, the girlfriend of Hoover's second-in-command, for aiding and abetting the gang's drug conspiracy. In the late 1960s, the court said, Larry Hoover and David Barksdale, the leaders of 2 Chicago street gangs, merged their gangs to form the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, which name was later shortened to Gangster Disciples. Hoover and Barksdale ruled the unified gang as King Larry and King David. But Barksdale's shared reign ended when he was killed soon after the gangs merged. In 1973, Hoover was convicted for ordering a double murder and has been incarcerated by Illinois ever since. But astonishingly, he continued to rule the Gangster Disciples from prison. Under Hoover's leadership, the gang rose to prominence, controlling a large part of the street-level drug trafficking in the Chicago area. At its height in the early 1990s, the gang's drug sales brought in about $100 million per year. In the 1980s, Hoover jettisoned the old way of business and changed things. He called himself the chairman of the board and formed his closest allies into two board of directors, an incarcerated board for the leaders in prisons and an unincarcerated board for the leaders on the outside. The directors oversaw all of the gang's operations. Below the directors were the governors, who were charged with running narcotic sales in specified areas throughout Chicago and its suburbs. A governor typically had about 1,000 gang members called foot soldiers working under him. A governor could control this many gang members because he had two more layers of leaders beneath him, the regents, who controlled smaller areas within a governor's territory, and coordinators, who controlled smaller areas within a region's territory. In 1990, Hoover appointed Gregory Shell, who was already a member of the unincarcerated board, to second in command, charged with controlling the gang's activities on the outside while Hoover was in prison. The Gangster Disciples specialized in street-level, low-price sales of small quantities of drugs. This presented two problems for the gang's leaders. The gang needed to control territory in which it could make sales, and needed to organize the actions of and collect the proceeds from thousands of foot soldiers carrying on the day-to-day sales. A gang-conducted census revealed that it had anywhere from 6,000 to 30,000 members selling drugs. The coordinators, regents, and governors had to control which foot soldiers sold where to ensure that the gang did not compete for sales against itself. If there was more demand in an area than the Gangster Disciples had foot soldiers to supply, the gang permitted dealers unaffiliated with a gang, called neutrons, to sell their wares so long as they paid a tax to the Gangster Disciples. But the Gangster Disciples violently suppressed any rival gang's attempt to sell in Gangster Disciple territory. In order to funnel proceeds from the enormous number of small sales to the gang's leaders, Hoover decided to charge each gang member certain dues, called the count, or the weekly. This was in effect a tax or franchise fee for doing business as a Gangster Disciple, similar to the tax levied on neutrons. The governors were responsible for getting the weekly into the directors and governors who owed back taxes, were likely to find themselves the unwilling recipients of a beating. Hoover also demonstrated his vision and organizational flair by forming a political action committee for the gang. That was called 21st Century Vote, and imposing another tax on gang members called the political, some of the revenue from which was funneled into the PAC. The gang also sponsored music concerts with mandatory attendance for gang members and used the concerts to launder drug money. In 1993, apparently dissatisfied with his profits as the chairman, Hoover developed a scheme called One Day a Week, or Nation Dope. One day each week, everyone selling within gang's territory had to sell drugs for Hoover himself. Hoover estimated that this would net him $200,000 to $300,000 each week. He thought there might be some resistance to Nation Dope, so he instructed the directors to put the word out that anyone refusing to sell Nation Dope would be shot. Hoover's analysis was simple. 1 day a week ain't much to ask for your life. Hoover knew that his phone calls in prison could be monitored, so whenever a director began to discuss business matters on the phone, Hoover cut him off and told him to come to the prison to see Hoover in person. So the directors had to go to whichever prison Hoover was currently in to receive their instructions. When Hoover was eventually transferred to Illinois' Vienna facility, traveling became a hardship because Vienna is located in the southern tip of the state, about a 6-hour drive from Chicago. But the directors regularly made this trip, and Hoover had a stream of visitors. In the fall of 1993, the government got a court order permitting it to place a transmitter in the visitor badge, giving to gang leaders who came to see Hoover. The government was thus able to monitor the conversations of the gang's inner leadership for 6 weeks until the transmitter was discovered. On August 3rd, 1995, a federal grand jury returned 3 separate indictments charging Hoover and 38 other Gangster Disciples with a conspiracy to sell narcotics and related offenses. In a 40-count superseding indictment, Hoover was again charged with 40 crimes, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise in violation of 21 U.S.C. 848. Starting on March 19, 1997, the court presided over a jury trial for Hoover, his second in command, Gregory Shell, and 4 other gang leaders. Approximately 7 weeks later, on May 9, 1997, the jury would come back, finding Hoover and his co-defendants guilty on every single charge. At Hoover's sentencing in June 1998, the court adopted the factual findings in the pre-sentence report prepared by the probation department. The court found that the Gangster Disciples were a South Side Chicago street gang of between 10 and 30,000 members. From the 1970s up until at least the date of the instant indictment, August 31st, 1995, the GDs controlled the distribution of illegal drugs on the south side of Chicago and the south suburbs of Chicago through a hierarchical structure and set of gang rules or laws which each gang member agreed to follow. Huge amounts of illegal drugs, mostly cocaine, were distributed down from the top ranks of the organization through the middle management to the street-level dealers. Hoover and other leaders in the gang had the power to order violations, meaning violent beatings, which sometimes rendered their victims hospitalized or killed. In order to conceal the illegal activities of the gang, members were forbidden from discussing the same with law enforcement authorities under the penalty of death. It was a profitable organization that would cost Hoover his life in prison. In taped conversations, Larry Hoover admitted that one day's drug profits for the entire gang easily totaled $300,000. In one day, $300,000, which would translate to approximately 4.5 kilograms of crack cocaine being sold on a daily basis. At that rate, the GDs are estimated to have grossed $109,500,000 annually from the sale of narcotics. When you walk into federal court and blow trial or are found guilty, there are sentencing guidelines that everyone must face. Hoover's guideline range was life imprisonment that was based on a total offense level of 43 and a criminal history category of 3. Aside from the guidelines, the court found that Hoover was subject to a mandatory life sentence on count 2 for engaging in a continual criminal enterprise in violation of 21 U.S.C. 848. More specifically, because Hoover was the chairman of a gang that sold at least 4.5 kilograms of crack per day and grossed over $100 million per year from drug sales, the court determined that Hoover was one of the principal administrators, organizers, or leaders of a continuing criminal enterprise, and 2, that the offense involved both at least 300 times the quantity of substance described in Section 841B1B, meaning more than 1.5 kilograms of crack, and at least $10 million in gross receipts during any 12-month period from drug trafficking. Hoover had, according to prosecutors, done all of this from a state prison cell. See, Larry Hoover had had enough of the ADX when President Trump changed the law. Hoover sought his release. He put all those things in the back of his mind. And on December 21st, 2019, Hoover would file the first of many motions for resentencing under the First Step Act. He asked the court to use its discretion to reduce his sentence, as set out in the Fair Sentencing Act. The government would object, arguing that this court lacked jurisdiction or discretion to resentence Hoover, and that Hoover's status as a notorious gang leader demanded that he die at ADX Florence. In its order dated July 6, 2022, the court held that it was authorized to reconsider Hoover's sentence under the First Step Act, but declined to exercise his discretion to resentence Hoover because he had not yet exhausted his administrative remedies. The court appeared sympathetic to the conditions of Hoover's incarceration and the lack of an opportunity to demonstrate rehabilitation, but expressed concern that Hoover had not fully availed himself of the BOP administrative process by which he could seek less restrictive confinement. Ultimately, the court denied the motion without prejudice. But Hoover would try again after exhausting his remedies by asking the federal prison system to file a motion for a reduction on his behalf. The Federal Bureau of Prisons denied his request, opening the door for Hoover to ask the judge again, and that he did. In doing so, he has renounced his gang affiliation and has told the court that he is a changed man. Experts have attested that he has a low risk of recidivism. What will the judge do? Will Hoover leave the ADX? The government has gone hard in the paint trying to make sure that Hoover's blood is left on the razor wire. The government wants Hoover to never walk out of the ADX. They want him to take his last breath there. Their court filings are clear. And his attorney in response has said, despite the government's continued effort to paint Mr. Hoover as a future threat, all objective evidence shows that Mr. Hoover is an old man who possesses neither the desire, the ability, nor the opportunity to lead a criminal enterprise. Hoover's lawyers have said Hoover is more likely to be killed by active gangster disciples if released to the streets than he is to regain the position he held 30 years ago. Whatever social capital Mr. Hoover purportedly has is largely of the government's making. Having buried Mr. Hoover alive with virtually no ability to demonstrate rehabilitation, all while perpetuating a stale gangster narrative that Hoover is powerless to refute. It should come as no surprise that there are people from all walks of life, including community activists, elected officials, and even celebrities, who reject the government's one-dimensional characterization of Mr. Hoover. That people love, support, and accept Larry Hoover as a complex human being capable of good, and not merely a notorious gangster, should be viewed as mitigating evidence, not aggravating evidence of his ability to influence the streets, which he has not and cannot. Larry Hoover owns his past and has paid his life for it, but his status and whatever symbolism the government believes he holds should not preclude resentencing in this case. Larry Hoover, the individual, must be separated from Larry Hoover, the legend. If you have ever seen the ADX or experienced it, you could easily say that Mr. Hoover is in fact serving a slow and torturous sentence of death under profoundly harsh conditions he has no ability to change. It is Mr. Hoover's status as a notorious gang leader that has condemned him to punishment, arguably worse than death, namely a sentence of life at ADX Florence. Does his permanent designation to ADX Florence serve a legitimate penological purpose, or is it motivated by his notoriety, not his conduct? Notably, some would say the government itself has played a significant role in cultivating and perpetuating Mr. Hoover's status, knowing that Mr. Hoover has no real ability to refute it or prove otherwise. ADX has gotten the best of Mr. Hoover. It is a lonely and desolate place. In a letter penned by Hoover from his solitary confinement cell, he declares unequivocally, "With respect to my culpability and my acceptance of responsibility, I want people to understand that the Larry Hoover speaking out today is a different person than the Larry Hoover accused in those past state and federal indictments. That being said, I do take responsibility for my wrongdoing and will not try to explain away or justify any of it. I was lost in an enduring pattern of criminality those many years ago. Looking back, thinking about what I have now come to understand about the nature of those things I have been involved and in fact had initiated, I cannot avoid taking responsibility. With this responsibility now being able to honestly assess and appreciate the magnitude and scope of the harms my actions had wrought, I cannot help but to have immense remorse." In his letter directed to this court, Mr. Hoover has more to say about his regret and remorse. "The consequences of my past conduct have been harsh. My experience has not been typical. Very few federal convicts are kept in the ADX for over 25 years. Nonetheless, I understand why this was done, and I want the court to hear from me that I accept responsibility. At the end of the day, I was the architect of my own fate. Most important, I am deeply remorseful for the harm that I caused my community. I do acknowledge that my past, though I've been off the grid for decades, has had a lingering, negative influence in sparring a segment of disaffected youth. Above all things, I regret this. I'm sorry for this, and not a day goes by that I don't feel that way. If I had any ability to influence them, I'd ask that they forget me and forsake the gang life forever." Mr. Hoover also writes, "I am no longer the Larry Hoover people sometimes talk about, or who he is written about in the papers, or the crime figure described by the government. That man has over these many years transformed into the man I am today. It is true that some men never learn, or that prison makes some into monsters. I've seen it. But for me, over time, this prison in particular, became a place of reflection. Though it has at times been painful, I've been able to come to terms with myself, what I have done, and the consequences and collateral damage my conduct manifested. I want nothing to do with my past. I want no association with those in that lifestyle. I just want to come home and be with my family. I am tired." Serving over a quarter century at ADX is far greater punishment than serving that same sentence at a maximum security facility. Prisoners at ADX spend 23 hours per day in concrete cells measuring 7 by 12 feet. Prisoners eat, sleep, and defecate in this confined space. ADX inhabitants spend their days in cells the size of a parking space. It is enough to make any man go crazy. Other individuals subject to solitary confinement have engaged in acts of self-harm, ranging from sewing their mouths shut, disassembling and consuming the contents of televisions, and smearing themselves with feces. Listen up, young man. This could be your life. Remember, Larry Hoover was only 23 years old when his life was stamped out. He has spent 2/3 of his life in prison, 1/3 of it in isolation under conditions that are aptly described as hell. Still, if released from federal prison, Larry Hoover still has life in Illinois. What happens with that sentence remains to be seen. Unlike the government's position in Rayful Edmonds' case, the government has told the court unfairly that there is nothing good to say about Larry Hoover. His lawyers say that statement is hateful and wrong. Even former AUSA Safer acknowledged that Mr. Hoover had done good during Mr. Hoover's prosecution. Mr. Hoover has rehabilitated himself under extraordinarily difficult circumstances and under cruel conditions designed to prevent rehabilitation. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or bitterness, Mr. Hoover has done nothing but sit with his thoughts and reflect on the consequences of his actions and the harm it has caused for 25 long years. His alleged notoriety should not be the driving force behind this court's denial of resentencing. This is particularly so where similarly situated defendants have obtained relief under the First Step Act for similar conduct. I say, free Larry Hoover. So now I'm going to tell you what I think is going to happen. I think Larry Hoover's going to get out of prison, right? And there's a lot of reasons why. Because I think the judge could have banged him long ago and just ruled on the merits and be like, man, get out of here. You're a danger to society. You're not getting out of federal prison. You're going to die in the ADX. And there's other people that are in this case, right, that have been released that, some people might not know about. Some of the co-defendants. So now I'm going to tell you what I think, man. I'm going to put my jailhouse lawyer's cap on. Many of you know that I was a jailhouse lawyer for many, many years. Own a paralegal and prison consultant firm, getting people out of jail. And I am the person that wrote the first compassionate release motion in the country to ever win. So what's my perspective? What do I think? Do I think Larry Hoover's going to get out of the ADX? Do I think he's going to get out of prison? I think that the judge is going to grant this motion. And I'm going to tell you why. I think the judge is going to grant it because he could have banged him earlier. And I could be wrong. He could have banged him earlier and said, nah, man, rule on the merits. You're no good. You're a threat to public safety under 3553A. I'm not letting you out of prison. But there's also other things in this case, like celebrities have wrote letters on his behalf, congressmen, I think a senator. But there's also co-defendants in this case that have been released, right? Mr. Strawthorne, he was sentenced to life in prison. And the court ended up granting that motion to time served and let him out. Mr. Jackson, 100 years, sentenced to 100 years. And the court reduced his sentence to 20 years. And I think he's out of prison. Mr. Edwards, he had a motion in for, So what do I think? Do I think Larry Hoover's going to get out of prison? Do I think he's going to get out of the ADX at least? I think so. I think they're going to grant his motion. I'm going to call it before it happens. I am the person that wrote the first compassionate release motion in the country and the first article telling people how they can get out of prison. It was published in the Criminal Legal News and the Prison Legal News. So I'm going to put my jailhouse lawyer's cap on today and tell you that I think Larry Hoover's going to have his motion granted. I think that there's a lot of reasons why. I think there are co-defendants in this case. Mr. Strawthorne, he was sentenced to life in prison. The court reduced his sentence. There was another brother, Mr. Jackson, had 100 years. The judge reduced his sentence to 20 years. So I think this is going to happen. On the flip side, I think Larry Hoover's going for a parole hearing on November 15th in the state. Do I think they're going to let him out of the state? Probably not on this one. But at least he'll be eligible once he leaves federal prison. And he'll be able to get in front of that parole board talk and say, look, man, the federal judge found that, I'm no longer a threat. There's numerous experts. There's all kinds of important people involved in this case. So do I think Larry Hoover's getting out of prison? I do. But what's the moral of the story? Let's not forget that Larry Hoover was only 23 years old. There's a bunch of young dudes out here getting money right now, doing your thing. You don't want to end up like Larry Hoover. You don't want to be in there, go to prison at 23 and arguing for your freedom at 71. But anyway, man, I hope you guys like this one. Stay tuned. We got more coming. Blood on the Razor Wire TV. Until tomorrow, with respect, we're out. Now, the real question that everybody probably wants to know, I'm going to have to put my lawyer cap on. Many of you know that, I was a jailhouse lawyer, spent 18 years in federal prison, and I am the person that wrote the first compassionate release motion that ever won in the country, right? And wrote the first article. So I kind of got a little insight on this. I believe that Larry Hoover's judge is going to release him from federal prison. And I say that for a lot of reasons. I mean, there's all kinds of people that support his motion, celebrities, congressmen. I think there's a senator, just a whole bunch of people, right? And at the end of the day, the judge also reduced the sentence of, I believe, co-defendant Strawthorne was sentenced to life in prison, and the judge reduced that to time served. There was another guy, Mr. Jackson, his 100 years, he was sentenced to 100 years. He reduced that to 20 years. That brother got out of prison. And then you got Mr. Edwards. He was sentenced to life. The judge reduced that sentence, let him out of prison, and has granted his early termination from any type of parole or probation under the federal system. So I believe that if the judge wanted to bang Larry, he could have done it a long time ago and been like, look, I'm ruling on the merits, man. You're a threat to public safety under 3553A. I'm not releasing you, whatever. But I think that the judge is going to release him. So he also has this other thing going on in Illinois where he has to see the parole board, which I think is going to be in 2 days, right? What's today? Sunday? Buffalo Bills, baby. But anyway, I think he goes to the parole board in Illinois on the 15th, and today is the 13th, so I don't think the parole people in Illinois are going to be ready, but I think on his next board, once he gets out of the federal system, once he gets out of ADX, he may very well have a very good shot at getting, parole over in Illinois. And I'm sure one of his arguments will be, hey, the federal judge found that I was rehabilitated. There's a lot of experts involved in this case, a lot of people that say he has a low recidivism rate, that he's no longer a threat to public safety. But at the end of the day, what's the moral of the story? Let's not forget that Larry Hoover was 23 years old when he was arrested, and he's now 71 years old and spent all of that time in prison, his whole life. And now he's fighting and arguing just to get out of the ADX for now. He just wants out of the ADX. So let's not forget that, okay? You're a young man, you're out there getting money, man. You don't want to be like Larry Hoover, man, fighting for your life at 71 years old after you spent damn near, 50 years in prison? Come on, man. With respect, Blood on the Razor Wire TV, I hope you guys like what we did today. We're going to keep doing this stuff. It's a whole lot different than Rayful Edmonds, right? But anyway, with respect, Blood on the Razor Wire TV, until tomorrow, we're out.